Hello everyone, Shintobean here with another Age of Sigmar battle report, chronicling the exploits of the Seraphon as they traverse through the mortal realms battling enemies of various shapes and sizes. In this battle, the Seraphon brought the Fangs of Sotek to the field, a sub-faction of the Starborn Seraphon that excel at hit-and-run tactics. Their enemies were the Ironjawz of the Orc war clans, tough as nails greenskins who are ferocious in close combat. Shout out to my friend Rob who brought this impressive force of orcs to the table. He actually has his own YouTube channel which has painting tutorials and 5-minute battle reports, so be sure to check that out. Neither of us are veterans of Age of Sigmar, and so this was a learning experience for both of us, but it was a very enjoyable battle. He was a great sport, and I definitely look forward to playing more battles against him in the future. Now for today's 1500 point battle, we used the Frontal Assault battle plan, which has 3 objectives in the center signified by those 3 grates. If you're wondering why those are the objectives, you can imagine that there's some sort of buried trove of treasure underneath each of those points. Frontal Assault also has a very large deployment zone for both sides, going all the way up to the objective line in the center. The Orc army, being 100% melee, deployed as close to the center as possible, with all of their battle line in a single, massively long line. The Seraphon, on the other hand, deployed a little more cautiously and further back, led by the mighty Lord Croak, commanding a large horde of skinks, but also having a Stegodon and some pterodons with a few support heroes to round out the army. The orcs finished deploying first and chose to take the first turn. The Megaboss made use of the Mighty Destroyer's command trait to bellow a command to the Gorgruntas, allowing them to make an extra movement in the hero phase. The 3 little pigs started making their way across the eastern side of the battlefield. Meanwhile, the rest of the orc army made a ferocious advance forward, claiming all 3 of the objectives and securing a solid position in the center of the battlefield with their entire battle line, scoring a lot of victory points without having to do any fighting. The Gorgruntas continued their advance in the movement phase, actually moving within charging distance of the great unit of skinks. However, being exhausted after all that running, the Gorgruntas failed their charge and were unable to make contact with the skinks, which was good news for the Seraphon because if they had actually made that charge, it would have had deadly consequences. The Seraphon did not relish the thought of engaging these orcs in close combat, being mostly a ranged army. So the Seraphon made a ferocious advance towards the center, but of course much less ferocious than the orc advance. The Stegodon fired off several bolts from its Skystreak bow, impaling several of the brutes, and the rest of the army marched forward, with Lord Croak casting down comets but dealing minimal damage to the orcs. The pterodons, learning their lesson from previous battles, hung towards the back, while the large unit of skinks with bolt spitters, which was threatened by the Gorgruntas, was teleported across the battlefield behind enemy lines into the rear of the west side of the battlefield. Here, empowered by the Skink Star Priest, they loosed a withering hail of 60 poisonous bolts into the backs of the orcs, taking down several of the Squighoppas as well as a few Ardboys. Meanwhile, in the center of the battlefield, the Stegodon went ahead and charged into the unit of brutes that had been weakened by the bow attack, and dealt some additional damage with the charging impact hits, as well as dealing significant damage with its main attacks. A War Chanta and a group of Ardboys, in response, piled in and started attacking the Stegodon, locking it in combat for the next round. So by the end of the first battle round, this was the state of the battlefield, with the orcs maintaining hold of all 3 objectives. Both sides were able to complete the battle tactic of ferocious advance. For the start of the second battle round, the orcs won priority and were able to take the first turn. For the battle tactic, they chose Bring It Down, making it their goal to take down the Stegodon by the end of the turn. The unit of Gore-Gruntas continued their advance on the eastern side of the battlefield, heading straight for the back line of the Seraphon army, where most of the heroes were congregated around Lord Croak. Meanwhile, the rest of the Orc army called for the mighty Wah, allowing them to advance with even greater swiftness and bringing them within charging distance of the bulk of the Seraphon army in the center of the battlefield. The Seraphon quickly found themselves encompassed on all sides by the oncoming tide of orcs. The Gore-Gruntas charged into the heroes in the backline, including the general of the Seraphon, dealing some damage with the initial impact hits, but being exhausted once again from all of that running, failed to do much damage with their attacks, and were not able to take down any of the Seraphon support heroes. The rest of the battle line units charged into the fray, with the Ardboys slamming into the Skinks with javelins, which did not stand a chance against the fearsome orcs in combat, and the entire unit of Skinks was wiped out before he was able to retaliate. The Stegodon put up a little more of a fight, dealing some damage and managing to take down a few more orc brutes. However, the combined attacks of the rest of the orc horde were able to indeed bring down the Stegodon, achieving their battle tactic for the turn. The Seraphon heroes turned around and fought back against the Gore-Gruntas, managing to take one of them down. However, the Pterodon riders, despite being within engagement distance, were not paying attention and did not get into the fight. On the western side of the battlefield, the Squighoppas turned around and ran towards the large unit of Skinks, but decided not to charge them because charging would have most likely been a suicide run, and instead spent their time dancing right in front of the Skinks' faces. Things were looking grim at the start of the Seraphon's second turn, with very few units available to answer against the relentless tide of orcs that was continuing their advance straight towards the heroes of the Seraphon. The Seraphon chose Conquer for the battle tactic, and then summoned in a new unit of Saurus Knights in an attempt to countercharge against the advancing orc horde. One more summoning point and they could have summoned something bigger, but this was the best they could do in the current situation. The Saurus Knights were a little bit too far away from the orcs and were unable to successfully charge into the enemy the turn that they were summoned. Lord Croak cast a few more comets and also Celestial Deliverance, dealing some mortal wounds to the surrounding orcs, but again not making much of an impact on the battle line. The Pterodon riders chose to retreat and fly straight over the Gore-Gruntas, dropping the payload onto the heads of the Gore-Gruntas, but dealing very little damage. Meanwhile, Lord Croak would have gladly engaged the group of Ardboys right in front of him, but was still engaged in combat from the Gore-Grunta from behind, so was only able to unleash a single attack against that one Gore-Grunta. On the other side of the battlefield, the large group of Skinks was teleported straight through the Squighoppas onto the westernmost objective, securing that for the Seraphon and achieving their battle tactic for the turn. They also unleashed another salvo of bolts, but that did minimal damage because they were no longer being poisoned by the Skink Star Priest. For the third battle round, the orcs once again won the priority role, taking the fight to the Seraphon, this time choosing Savage Spearhead as their battle tactic to advance deep into the Seraphon territory. Moving off of the objectives, they put themselves into a good position to charge all of the units of Seraphon on the field. The first units to enter the fray was a single War Chanta and a single Squighopper charging into the large unit of Skinks with Bolt Splitters, which unleashed all 60 of their shots into the one War Chanta. However, again, without the poison, they were only able to deal a single point of damage. A group of Ardboys charged into the Saurus Knights, engaging them in combat, which meant that the Knights would not be able to get the charge bonus from their lances. However, the Knights fought back with cold ferocity, managing to take down quite a few of the Ardboys in combat. But the thick of the battle was occurring in the center against Lord Croak, with almost all of the orc forces surrounding him and piling all of their attacks in, including the Mega Boss, who had not been able to fight on previous turns. With their combined attacks, they were able to deal 17 damage, bringing Lord Croak down to a single health point. At which point, Lord Croak retaliated with 13 attacks into the surrounding orcs, but dealing very little damage. He was then taken down with a final series of attacks, leaving a gaping hole where he had been, and also leaving behind his 2 loyal skink priests. One of them was turned into mincemeat by the Gore-Grunta, but the other, the skink star priest, somehow survived unscathed. And this was where the orc's 3rd turn ended, leaving the Seraphon with a single hero and only 3 other units remaining on the field. However, the Seraphon still had a few tricks up their sleeve and chose Savage Spearhead for their battle tactic on the 3rd turn, with the goal of diving deep into the enemy territory. The skinks with bolt splitters again fired over 50 shots into the war chanter, but without the poison were unable to kill him, which forced them to then turn to the combat phase, surrounding him entirely and stabbing him with their knives. The war chanter was able to slay a few skinks before finally succumbing to his wounds. The remaining knights fared decently well, taking down all but one of the Ardboys in their unit that they were fighting against. Looking at the big picture, the Pterodon riders on the east side flew across the field to claim the easternmost objective, and then the skink star priest was teleported out of combat to claim the objective in the center of the battlefield. So for the first time, the Seraphon were able to claim all 3 objectives on this 3rd turn. These orcs were still celebrating after having managed to kill Lord Croak in a single turn, but after a few bellowed commands from the Megaboss, turned around and charged across towards the objectives in the center to take them from the clutches of the Seraphon. In response to the advancing orcs, the skink star priest redeployed to position itself closer to the group of skinks. The Pterodon riders, on the other hand, were not so lucky and were successfully charged by the Megaboss and Gore-Grunta. The Megaboss, who had not been able to do so much in combat, took out his anger, slaying 2 of the Pterodon riders, and then the 3rd was speared by the Gore-Grunta before they could retaliate. The remaining orcs were at this point too far away from the skinks to be able to make a successful charge, but settled by taking the center objective, achieving their battle tactic of Conquer for that turn. For the Seraphon's 4th turn, they chose Broken Ranks for the battle tactic, targeting the single Ardboy that had been left by the Saurus Knights. Once again empowered by the Star Priest's Venom and the Hand of Glory, the unit of skinks fired off another volley of bolts, split firing between the Ardboy and another group of Ardboys in the center lane, killing several of them and then coming within range to once again seize the center objective from the orcs. On the 5th and final battle round, the orcs once again won priority, meaning they won priority in every single round of this game. The orcs quickly advanced towards the center, once again seizing the center objective, and then the unit of Ardboys was the first to attempt to charge the skinks, which unleashed a volley of empowered bolts, wiping out the whole unit of Ardboys and then retreating around the Star Priest to protect it from harm. But the remaining Gore-Grunta, War-Chanta, and Brutes slammed into the ranks of the skinks, slaying many of them in the following combat phase. The skinks rallied and then fought for their lives, fighting back, and over the course of the next turn were finally able to take down the final Gore-Grunta, as well as a few Brutes. At the end of the 5th battle round, all that remained was 3 skinks, a War-Chanta, 2 Brutes, the Megaboss, and then the Star Priest, which was once again teleported across the battlefield to claim the easternmost objective. The Star Priest then ended the game by firing off a bolt into the Megaboss, dealing 1 damage to it, which was the only damage that it suffered this entire game. For the final tally, the Seraphon managed to complete 4 of their battle tactics, but did a very poor job of controlling the objectives, scoring a measly 15 victory points. Meanwhile, the Ironjawz completed 4 battle tactics, their grand strategy, and also held on to most of the objectives for the majority of the game, and ended up with a score of 26 victory points by the end of the battle. Victory for the Ironjawz. The MVPs for the Ironjawz were these pigs, the Gore-Gruntas, who managed to run far enough that they probably could have run an entire lap around the battlefield throughout the course of this battle. For the Fangs of Sotek, the large unit of skinks with bolt spitters was the most effective unit in this army. However, they would have been much more effective had they had the full support of the Skink Star Priest throughout the battle, as was seen when they attempted to take down the War Chanta, firing over 100 bolts but failing to kill it, in one of the more memorable moments of this battle. At this point, the Seraphon have lost so many games that I might as well rename this series to Watch the Seraphon Lose Against Every Faction in Age of Sigmar. But it was a very enjoyable game. Again, big thank you to Rob for being a good sport and playing, and be sure to check out the content on his channel. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.